you can download Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, otherwise called SSMS, for free. This is a graphical interface tool that lets you make a connection to a SQL server, whether it's on premises or in the cloud, so that you can manage databases and the entire environment. I've already downloaded and installed SSMS on my on-premises computer. So let's go into the console and take a look at what we've got for databases. I'm going to go to the RDS console, and on the left, I'm going to go to databases. Okay, so I've got a database. The identifier is database-1. It's a Microsoft SQL Server Express Edition configuration. The region and availability zone are shown. The database size is shown. The status is available. There's not a whole lot of CPU activity, around 7%, and there are no current sessions. Now, what I can do is click on the database identifier link to open up the properties of the database. Now, I could modify the configuration under the Actions menu. I could stop the database, reboot, delete it, take a snapshot, restore it from backup. But what I want to do here is down under Connectivity and Security, I want to copy the endpoint. That's basically a DNS name that points to our database instance running in the Amazon Web Services cloud. And it's listening by default on the standard SQL port, which is 1433 over TCP. Notice also, over on the far right under Public Accessibility, it's set to Yes. Now, the default value for that is Private Accessibility. In other words, Public Accessibility, no. So you would have to be, for instance, VPN'd into the AWS cloud in order to be able to manage the database instance. But here it's publicly accessible, so I'm good to go for my on-premises machine running SSMS. So I'm going to fire up that tool from my Start menu since I've already downloaded it and I've already installed it. Now I'm presented with the Connect to Server screen, where the database engine is what's been selected, and I've specified the server name. That's the endpoint that I just copied from my RDS config. The authentication is SQL Server Authentication, not Windows or Active Directory. The default username when I deployed that database was set to admin, and I've specified the password. Let's go ahead and connect by clicking Connect. Okay, and at this point, I am now connected in the AWS cloud to my Microsoft SQL Server RDS instance. So if I were to expand databases on the left, go into System Databases, we have all of the normal behavior that we would have if this were an on-premises SQL server. If we go to Security, go down to Logins, we'll have the same type of thing we would normally see for SQL-based logins. There's the admin account we logged in with, by the way. So while we don't have access to the underlying server operating system, we do have access, of course, to SQL database objects. Otherwise, what would the point be? So at this point, it's a database design issue depending on how the database is being used to support an app of some kind or whatever's going to be stored in the database. That would determine how we would then drill down into our specific databases and then perhaps examine existing tables, views, stored procedures, or of course right-click and build new objects as required. Back here in the RDS console in the databases view, if we refresh our database, we could then start clicking on things like the current activity sessions, which takes us really into the performance insights for the database. Very valuable information. You can even use this to establish a baseline of normal activity over time. So we have things like database load. You can select the chart type that you want to use to monitor this type of information. You can go to top users to see who's been using most of the processing time on the server, perhaps by issuing long, complicated queries. Let's go ahead and change the public accessibility option to verify that it does have the impact we think it will, which means we shouldn't be able to connect from SQL Server Management Studio. So if we go back to my database listing on the left, click on that database identifier and click Modify, and then scroll all the way down under Additional Configuration under Certificate Authority. It's currently publicly accessible. I'm going to choose Not Publicly Accessible. And it tells me that EC2 instances and other devices outside of the VPC where this database was deployed will not be able to connect to it. So you could still remote into an EC2 instance in that same VPC. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll all the way down to the bottom, and in the bottom right, I'll click Continue. We have a summary of our modifications about public accessibility. Now, we want to watch this scheduling of modifications. When do we apply this change? The default is to apply it during the next scheduled maintenance window, and we have a date and timestamp showing when that will be. or we could choose to apply it immediately. The reason maintenance windows are used is to limit the amount of disruption background maintenance like config changes, the application of patches will have against a live running production database. So apply immediately, modify DB instance. And it says it successfully modified it. Now, if I click back on that database identifier, down under networking, it's important to note the VPC it was deployed into, the default VPC in this case. So that means that you would have to have instances deployed somewhere in there, in these subnets, in order to make a connection if it's not publicly accessible. And you might have to go back and refresh the view and then click on it to open it again for some of these changes to actually show up here, such as public accessibility now reflecting no. Okay, so I'm going to disconnect here in SQL Server Management Studio and try to reconnect once again. And try as it may, it will not make a connection because it's no longer publicly visible. The other thing to bear in mind is that while we can go to the Actions menu to stop, reboot, and delete database instances, if you know you're going to need RDS database compute power for at least a year or more, for the long term, you need it running 24/7, you should consider the use of reserved instances. When you purchase reserved database instances, you can realize a large cost saving as compared to running them on demand all of the time, the way we're doing it right now. So think about then what the workload requirements are for the database and whether it makes sense or not to use reserved instances to reduce database costs.